Hi, I'm Dina Davidson. I'm the Campus Life Director of Thrive School. Several years back, my grandma passed away, and my grandpa Jerry found himself with a lot more time on his hands, and obviously it was a very lonely season of his. And I got to watch an amazing transformation start to take place in his life. As he found with his free time and his lonely moments, what he ended up doing was diving into Scripture for the first time in his life. And this was towards the end of his life, but it was crazy. As his granddaughter, I used to pick him up before church every Sunday, drive him to church, and then afterwards we would go catch some lunch at Bodine's in Carson City. And we would sit there across the lunch table, and he would tell me about what he was reading. And it was crazy to hear him, in his late 80s, describing the Bible stories he was reading for the very first time. And I loved listening just to his newfound passion for God and what he was learning about God. But one particular afternoon, as we were sitting across the table at Bodine's, he just kind of looked at me and said, I love what I'm learning. I love these stories about Jesus, and he got a really concerned look on his face, but I don't know about that Old Testament. And he started to talk about how he was wrestling with certain passages in Scripture, and then he proceeded to tell me how he would tell God his mind about those passages and how they really didn't make sense and he didn't quite agree. And as he was wrestling with these hard passages, he mentioned, I'm going to have to talk to your dad about these passages. And he knew my dad, John Jackson. He was this great intellect, great pastor at the time at our church. And so he knew that if he talked to my dad, Dad would be able to solve it for him. Just a great, great plan of life. But I love my grandpa's approach to Scripture. And I wish we could have the same type of attitude and approach that my grandpa Jerry had. Late in his life, discovering his passion for Scripture, he decided that when he ran into a difficult passage, he wouldn't stop reading. Instead, he would wrestle. And I loved the honest way that he wrestled with God, telling him his mind about that passage. And I loved how he phoned a friend. So practically, what do we do with the Old Testament? What do we do when we read Old Testament passages and they seem to be completely different pictures of God and His will than what we find in the New Testament? I've got two practical pieces of advice from my grandpa Jerry. The very first one is I encourage you to adopt the attitude towards the Old Testament that Jesus himself had. In fact, Jesus directly addresses this issue of the Old Testament in his Sermon on the Mount. Let's read. Matthew 5:17 through 18. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So in this passage, Jesus directly goes after explaining what his view of the Old Testament is. And he firmly places his stamp of approval on the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to adopt the attitude that Jesus had towards the Old Testament. There is no division between Jesus' New Testament view of God and Old Testament view of God. One and the same. Jesus clearly puts his stamp of approval on the Old Testament. Second, phone a friend. Just like my grandpa Jerry said, I'm going to have to talk to your dad about this passage. Who do you know who just nerds out over Scripture? Who do you know that deeply dives into those difficult passages? The ones that make you hate reading the Old Testament? Who loves those passages? Would they be willing to grab coffee with you, maybe send an email explaining that passage? Or maybe you don't have any friends. Maybe you don't have access to the John Jackson like my grandpa did. But you can still grab a resource that dives into this. My ultimate favorite resource is From Creation to the Cross. It basically goes through every single Old Testament book and explains what the purpose of that book is and where Jesus himself is found in that Old Testament book. So absolutely recommend it. Last but not least, phoning a friend might very practically mean asking Jesus to explain that passage. I think we powerfully underestimate how willing Jesus is to help us interpret the Old Testament. But we got to be willing to wrestle with it, not just give him maybe a soundbite worth of attention. We have to let it simmer over a few weeks, maybe over a few months. So I hope this encourages you. We have to adopt the attitude that Jesus had towards the Old Testament, stamp of approval on it. We need to phone a friend when there's passages we don't understand. And I'll leave you this question. The Bible has 66 books, Old and New Testament. The New Testament only has 27 of those. Which one do we want us telling us about God? Do we want the one with 66 books telling us about the complexities of God, or do we want just 27? I think God has given us 66. Let's make sure we study, examine, and wrestle with all of them.